Say you have a south-facing fence, but you don't have anywhere in the ground to grow. It's just another option. It's a container that you can use to maximize your space.
You're listening to the Food Garden Life Show, the show that helps you grow food, whether it's on a balcony, in a backyard, or bigger. I'm your host, Stephen Biggs.
And I'm your host, Donna Balzer. Together we talk with gardening experts, and we talk about what we've done in our years in the horticultural trade, helping you bend the rules and grow food in a way that suits you and your growing zone.
Welcome to our container gardening episode, and our hope today is to set you up for container gardening, vegetable growing success for this year. And Donna, I think one of my favorite container gardening memories is that time that you and I went to our friend Joanne's rooftop garden, which is here in Toronto. And Joanne has about 500 square feet, intensively gardened, and it was just amazing. Everything she had packed into that space, but a big part of her recipe for success was these containers, which also had reservoirs in them. And so those plants didn't have any water stress. She had a good soil mix in there. And yeah, that was really an amazing garden. Do you remember that?
And people often say, I just have nowhere to garden, nowhere to grow. Well, Joanne defied all of that. I mean, we had to go into her house, up her stairs, through her bedroom, into her bathroom, out a window. And there was that little flat area that was just over her front porch. And the reason she gardened there was because she had full sun, almost full sun. Whereas because she was an inner city garden, all those big urban trees, she just couldn't get sun anywhere else. So where there's a will, there's a way. Joanne really pointed that out.
Yeah. And, that makes me think of another wonderful container garden that we saw together, another rooftop garden in Quebec City. And that was the garden that was atop a soup kitchen. And so that it was really neat because the people using that soup kitchen could also take part in the garden. But although this garden was also amazingly productive, it was done so differently. So Joanne had the sub-irrigated containers, and this rooftop garden in Quebec City, they were using those fabric grow bags with little spaghetti irrigation tubes. So a very different system, but amazingly productive.
And I have to say, even before I saw Quebec or met Joanne, I was growing on my little tiny balcony just off my second story as well, because again, it was one spot in my inner city garden where I had sun. And I was using these sub irrigated pots up there. Again, this was before I knew you and knew it was a thing. I had already started doing that. The funny thing is, when we had the house sitter come visit us, we had grown squash, spaghetti squash, and it had grown over the balcony and had gone down below. And when our house sitter got out of our garage late one night when he first started house sitting, he bonked his head right into one of our big spaghetti squash, and he thought he was being attacked. And it was crazy. So that's just how well you can grow in an inner city area or anywhere where you think you don't have sun. Look around. Something will pop up.
And I should say too, that even for people who have decent sized yards, so I'm in this semi-suburban yard here, I've got space on the ground. It's not all perfect for gardening, but I have a flat roofed garage. And so after seeing Joanne's garden, after being to that garden in Quebec City, I scratched my head and I thought, why am I not gardening on my garage roof? And when I turned it into a garden, it became the most productive part of my yard because you've got sun, but equally as importantly, there's lots of heat up there too.
hmm Well, I've seen that garden and it's fantastic. So as long as your roof doesn't cave in, Steve, you'll be okay.
Yeah, and actually that's a big thing to point out for anybody intrigued by this idea of rooftop gardening. You need to understand what the load-bearing capacity of your roof is, and the kind of expert that you would talk to find that out would be a structural engineer.
Well, typically when they do commercial buildings, they do call in structural engineers, but I understand they are hard to get right now. It's hard to find an engineer. So just remember that every 10, is it 10 gallons of water? Every gallon of water weighs 10 pounds.
Mhm.
So that's about 5 kilos. So It's heavy. Like it's not so much the soil. We're often using the soilless mix, but it's the water.
Yeah, indeed.
Hmm.
Okay. Well, where should we start? I was thinking today we could talk about containers, soil, location, care. I guess
Hmm.
containers is really the first thing we have to think about, isn't it?
Hmm. For sure. I've done everything from rain gutters to big old, like you say, the fabric pots, really huge fabric pots, actually. So I've used all kinds of containers and we can start anywhere. What do you want to talk about? Drainage
Sure.
or?
Well, maybe I'll start with a type of container that I've used a lot over the years because I'm cheap. And having worked in the greenhouse and nursery trade, I had access to the big nursery pots. And those are the black pots that shrubs and trees come in. And I got some that were about a half barrel size, those really big ones that are used for large trees. And those formed the backbone of my first rooftop garden. They're not pretty, but if aesthetics doesn't really matter, then it can be a very inexpensive option. So you can buy them if you go to somebody servicing the commercial nursery trade, but also if there are arborists at work in your neighborhood, you can ask them and just see if they have them either to give you or sell you for a good price. So I think we should start with that. For people looking for a lower budget opportunity, that's a good place to start.
Especially if they have a drainage tray, because otherwise that water just goes right onto your rooftop and drains away. So I find it's really important to have a drainage tray. And thankfully, they're selling really large trays. Or you can just use a boot rack or something like that. So, something that would just slightly hold the water, but you can't let all that water run off. That's for sure.
Mhm. Yeah. The other thing that I've done on my driveway garden, and maybe this is a whole other episode, is I used straw bales as my container. And let's do a whole other straw bale episode, but I'll just throw the idea out there for people who are intrigued. And we do have a couple previous episodes all about straw bales, but the bale becomes both the container and the growing medium. And I'll say no more.
I'll say something. I'll say, I
Okay.
thought you said you were cheap. And I find straw bales, especially in the city, are really expensive, especially in the West. We've had some really droughty years, and a lot of the straw, which usually is used for bedding for animals, is, hard to get. And it's up to $10 a bale. And I don't find that cheap. And you have to use that new one every year. So I find that expensive.
You make a good point, but I do use the straw bales for winterizing my figs and for
Mm.
mulching in my veggie garden. So I think I get 3 uses out of them, so I don't feel so upset about the cost. But it's a good point. We should mention terracotta pots because a lot of people love the look of terracotta pots. I do too. I kind of got turned off of terracotta when I had little kids zipping around on tricycles because when they tip over, they just break so easily. So know that terracotta is fragile, both from kids, but also if you leave them out for the winter filled with soil, they usually crack.
Mm. Even when they say weatherproof, because I just recently bought a new terracotta pot. I wanted that look for my lemon. You know how lemons need to have
Mhm.
soil that can dry out?
Yeah.
But I find the biggest trouble with terracotta pots is that they are so heavy.
Yeah.
So if you've already got the weight of the soil and the plant, and now you add another, what, 10 kilo, 20 kilo, just for a big, big terracotta pot, they're so heavy. And so you have to think of that as part of the picture.
I
I
think
found
Don,
that.
most of the terracotta pots that are mass produced are not frost proof. There is a special type, I think it comes from the UK somewhere, that you pay an arm and a leg for that is supposed to be resistant to frost. I've never tried them because I'm cheap, but that is something to know. But yes, that the weight is a big issue for sure.
Yeah, cheaper
Okay.
than I was gonna say, the one I bought, I'll keep you informed how it works. It was super heavy, though.
We both mentioned today those grow bags. So that garden we talked about in Quebec City, and I've used them extensively on my driveway, grown potatoes in them, grown herbs in them. But I know you've done an awful lot with those. So maybe let's talk about those. What do you have to share on those?
You know what I loved about them is that they breathe just like terracotta. So everything you love about terracotta, you are gonna love about these grow bags. And there's many, many, many brands. So check with the retailer to see if they're food safe before you take them home. There's a lot of them online. And also remember that Not I've tried the ones that go against the wall that hang from your wall. They look really pretty, but they dry out within minutes. So you take a picture the day you plant them, they look great, and about 3 days later, they're all dried out. And I'm not saying I'm a bad gardener, Steve. I'm just saying you've got to really watch out that they do dry out. So when you're planning to use grow bags, also plan to use the sub trays, the big trays that go under them so that you could have them wicking up that water the whole time you're using them. But other than that, I love them. For instance, I started all my potatoes super early one year. I just put in my greenhouse, I put some um, cords that were warm, the ones that you might use on your rooftop to keep your roof from freezing up. I put them right on the soil, on top of the soil, put the grow bags on top of that, planted my potatoes, and by the time I moved them outside, when I had to put all my tomatoes in my greenhouse, those potatoes looked really great and had really established early. So they're really flexible. I use them for a lot of herbs. I use them, as I said, for tomatoes. What I like about them is that they're washable. So if you ever have an outbreak of any kind of disease, you can empty the soil and wash them. So I love that.
I have one more thing to add about the grow bags too, is I've seen one somewhere that had a little flap at the side, like a little door. And it was designed for potatoes because you can also buy in plastic pots. You can sometimes buy these potato pots where you
This
can
is
open.
terrible and cheesy. This is cheesy, Steve. This is not real gardening. This is those beginner gardeners that are looking for something cheesy.
Well, I made one of those potato pots out of two nursery pots where I cut a hole in one and I slid
Uh,
it into another pot for my kids when we were growing potatoes on the driveway so that they could excitedly harvest a couple potatoes.
well, okay. But you can just reach into the pots and feel around for the potatoes and pull them out the same as you would in your garden outside. They wouldn't be able to come in from the side. So I think it's kind of one of those, oh,
You
yeah,
make a
they're
good
trying,
point. It's a
yeah,
bit
yeah,
gimmicky, but
a
yeah.
bit gimmicky. Yeah, yeah. But
Now
I
we
have tried them just because I was given them as a free sample and I didn't find they really work. Same with the ones I cut slits into the side of some of the fabric pots to put extra strawberries on the side. I didn't find it really paid off. Better to just plant your strawberries in the top, let them spill over, benefit from that. Don't have extras sticking in the side that are just going to dry out. The pots are just going to dry out.
Coming up, we have more container ideas for you, also talking about soil for your containers, about location, and about container garden care. Coming up in just a moment. A shout out today to all of you who are joining me for Fig Camp this week. We're in the second sitting of Fig Camp, and people from New York, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Vermont, Alberta, Ontario, Manitoba, all sorts of cold climate fig enthusiasts, a real privilege to hang out with you and talk about figs. So thanks for being with me. Next week, Donna and I are running a container vegetable camp. If you are thinking about gardening in containers this year, check it out. It's two-part. It's a deep dive into how to successfully grow lots of veggies in containers. More details at foodgardenlife.com. Some new content on the website, foodgardenlife.com. We have a piece all about a dragon's garden. If you are gardening with kids, if there are kids in your life, I think you'll love this story. A story about Finn, who came to one of the talks that my daughter Emma and I gave, and the next day I had a note from his mom that it had inspired him to create a dragon-themed garden. So get ideas for some toothy, pointy, spiny plants to make a super fun garden for kids. foodgardenlife.com.
You're listening to the Food Garden Life Show.
The show that helps you grow food, whether it's on a balcony, in a backyard, or bigger.
Now back to our chat about growing veg in containers.
I have another type of container to add in here, Donna, which is hypertufa. And for those who aren't familiar with the concept, you're using cement. Maybe let me back up. When we talk about concrete, concrete is where you mix cement with aggregate like sand and gravel. But if you mix cement with something like potting soil, then you get something that has a stone-like appearance, but it's lighter. And so this can be a do-it-yourself project if you like that kind of thing. And so I've done that with the kids. you can either make a fairly dry mix that you pack onto the outside of an existing pot to shape it, and then you remove the pot and you're left with your new hypertufa container. Or if you make the mix a little bit wetter, you can put it into a form as you would with concrete. So I mentioned hypertufa because it breathes. And but if you're looking for something a little bit more permanent, we had these hypertufa troughs that we used for mint, and they worked great. And of course, then the mint isn't spreading all over the garden, but they have a nice natural look. So I like hypertufa. Is that something you've ever tried?
Not for 20 years, Steve. That's old school now. In fact, I got the reason I'm remembering it, I got an email from someone. I used to teach this in a class, and I got an email from someone that made a hypertufa trough with me 20 years ago at a program. And she sent me a picture of how great her little hens and chicks look in her hypertufa. So she hasn't changed out the plants. She hasn't done anything for
Mm,
20 years. And because if you use drought tolerant plants in something that's going to drain really fast, like hypertufa, it ends up being that you don't accidentally overwater them. It's a lot of work, but it can be a lot of fun. You can make stepping stones for your garden as well with that mixture. So it's quite fun. But again, I think it's a whole other episode because hypertufa, well, there's recipes, different recipes. And generally
mm,
we didn't mix ours with potting soil. We just mixed it with perlite and that
okay.
made it light. So it's fun, but I think I don't think it really has a place in food growing. I don't know.
I have one other thing to add here, which is wood for people thinking about making wooden containers. I know I have on my radar for this year making some Versailles style planters for my figs and citrus. But you see people making wooden containers for decks, patios. And I wanted just to mention don't use pressure treated wood because the pressure treated wood in times past, I think it was an arsenic compound. Now it's a copper compound that they use. But anyway, it's stuff that you don't want around the roots of your edible crops.
And I want to mention that wood rots. So it'll rot your deck, it'll rot itself, it'll be decomposed over time. So when I've used wooden planters, which we featured in our book, No Go Vegetable Gardening, we actually put styrofoam, the rigid styrofoam on the inside of the pot and on the bottom so that no wet soil would ever touch the wood. And that helps to extend that life of that plant for quite a while. The other thing I did with my Versailles style wooden pots is I put casters on the bottom so that I could move them away. You'll be surprised how much just riffraff builds up underneath your pots, just blows in or comes from somewhere. So casters are a really good idea if you're going to use wooden pots. But I don't think we've talked about rain gutters. Have we talked about
No. And since you're the one who's done that, go ahead.
that?
I call them eaves troughs, but
Eaves troughs, rain gutters. You buy them just at the big box stores. People usually don't buy them because when they're getting their eaves troughs redone, somebody just installs them. But they're available in 4-inch and 5.5-inch sizes, and the bigger the better. And they can be mounted on, say you have a south facing fence, but you don't have anywhere in the ground to grow because you've got perennials growing in the ground. It's just another option. It's a container that you can use to maximize your space. So using the biggest ones available, buying the end caps, filling with soil, and finding some kind of a drip tape or some kind of an irrigation system that means you don't have to go out every 5 minutes to water because
mhm,
they do tend to dry out. You also have to drill a hole in them so that they don't become swimming pools. Because if you get a really heavy deluge, and this might apply to all pots, you have to have a way for the water to get out. So when I first did the rain gutters, I drilled the holes on the very bottom, but then as soon as you watered them, the water just escaped. So I was told to put that drill hole just a 1/4 inch up, just a little bit up from the very bottom. And that way a little bit of water will sit in them, but then when it gets to be too much, it'll drain off. And I've had really good success in my greenhouse growing strawberries in rain gutters. So I just set up brackets so I can use that whole side wall of my greenhouse, stick my strawberries little plants into that. And, I'm just loving that. And I don't attach them in any way. So I can move the whole thing outside of the greenhouse and over to, say, a fence later if I want. And it's really quite fun. It's a way to expand what you've got. Big downside, you have to be on the watering or set up automatic irrigation.
mhm. Okay. Well, this is great. So we've covered some ideas for things that can be used as containers. I had a couple things to add as people are thinking about choosing containers. First of all, make sure it's big enough because what you need for, say, a pepper plant might not be as much as you'd need for a big indeterminate tomato plant. So you want enough soil to be suitable for whatever you're growing. And then the other thing is if you are growing taller things like tomato plants, or, I have olives, that these things can tip over in the wind. And so the worst kind of pot you can get is these nice vase shaped pots with a narrow bottom because just a little bit of wind and they tip over. So I like to suggest looking for something with a wide base if it's fairly tall and is likely to catch the wind.
Yeah, yeah, it's true. Especially those nursery pots. When you go to nurseries, often they're standing there picking up their trees off the ground because of big wind, because it's like a flag. The
Mm.
top of the plant is like a big flag, and then it just pulls over the whole plant. So at least with tomatoes, you most likely have them tied to something above, maybe your eaves troughs or something, or your what is that overhang called on your house? The
Mhm.
don't know. Anyway, often you'll tie up things like tomatoes, but otherwise, if you've got a big flag, it's just going to blow in the wind and that's going to cause that pot to tip over. So, again, careful with containers that way.
Okay. Well, we should talk about soil too, because I think if you combine good containers with good soil with the right care and location, then, those four things work together for success. And I guess the main comment I'd have on soil is don't be cheap. Don't buy those discount soil bags for, a buck each at the big box store because very often you get what you pay for. And with soil, we want something that drains well. We want something though that also holds moisture, that has airspace in there for roots to get around. And my advice to anybody who's doing container gardening on any scale is to actually buy the commercial size bales of soilless potting mix that's used in the industry because it tends to have more consistently good quality than the little tiny bags that you buy at garden centers, the ones that are packaged up for homeowners. What would you add to that?
Well, during the pandemic, I couldn't get the soil that I normally used. And instead, I got a high porosity soil. And I thought, oh, this will never work. I'll have to remember to water more often. But, in fact, it worked just fine. And so there's quite a range of what can work for you. But I would say the same thing you've said, which is to buy the big bales. And if you have to customize it for your plants later, that can work too. You just add maybe some more worm castings or some of your own homemade compost when you're transplanting into it. And that can personalize or customize your soil for your own plants.
Yeah. Well, here's one other thing that people often ask me about containers and potting soil is, do I have to change all the soil every year? So my response to that would be absolutely not, because the potting soil is a considerable expense. But if you're thinking about your footprint in the environment too, remember that potting soils are based usually either on coir or on peat moss. And coir is it's the fiber from palms, and those are grown halfway around the world. So there's this big footprint of that. And peat moss, of course, is carbon that's sequestered long term in the ground. And then we're using that. So don't throw out your potting soil every year and start fresh. You can absolutely use it more than once. But what I do is I'll add some fresh potting soil at the top of a container. Maybe an
And
inch.
do You can do that, but that potting soil tends to compress over time. So if you're growing annuals in them every year, what I've done is put out a big tarp, dump out the pots onto the tarp, add extra drainage material like perlite, or just add extra worm castings so that you're kind of fluffing it up a bit
Mm,
because it can get very compressed. I at least change out the top third and take that out and remix it and add some slow release fertilizer. If I'm in a really wet climate, like on the West Coast, I would actually add some agricultural lime because that will help soil becomes acidic over time just with the rain or the extra watering. And I think that really helps. So at least the top third. But if you don't have a lot of pots that you're dealing with, just get out a tarp, dump them out, remix them up, fluff them up, add them back in and replant. And that's good enough. You might find you add a bit more soil, but if I'm going to add anything, I tend to add worm castings instead of soil because I really like how they both inoculate the soil, but they also really twig something in the plants. It really stimulates growth when you add worm castings.
Good. That's a great suggestion. And if anybody wasn't clear on the rationale for doing that, for dumping it out and mixing in more through the entire soil volume, it's because the fibers that are in the soil, whether it's coir or peat moss or some other material, they do break down over time. And so they degrade, and that's natural. They're decomposing. And so what you're talking about is adding some other fibrous material in there so that you still have nice mix of air and potting soil in there.
But there's something you will never add.
Tell
People
me.
ask me about this all the time. Never add sand. For
Mm,
most of our vegetables that we're growing, they're never going to benefit from sand. Sand is heavy. Sand compacts. Even on the beaches of Florida where they have palm trees, they have soil compaction just in that sand. So don't add sand. Instead, something like the perlite product that I already talked about is an exploded, puffed up rock. So it holds space, doesn't let the soil collapse on itself. It holds the space, also increases the drainage, and gives the roots a little somewhere to grow.
good advice. Yeah, and the only time I use sand is for things like my olive trees where I want a heavier potting soil that drains well and I don't want them to tip over. So the added weight of the sand is good there. But olives are a whole other episode that we'll have to tackle. So let's just think for a minute about location. So we've talked about choosing containers, we've talked about potting soil. And if we're thinking about the location for our containers, I think it's more a question of matching the location to the crop. So if you're growing heat lovers, then you want sun and heat. So eggplants, tomatoes, peppers, melons, all of those things, as much sun and as much heat as possible. But if you're growing leafy greens, then you don't want them in full sun all summer. And really then the location will depend on what you're growing.
The best spot for leafy greens, I just love to tuck in pots against the house or containers against the house where, it's on the east side where it's going to get that really great morning sun, but not get that really dry west sun. So, or maybe you're just dealing with a balcony, you're gardening on a balcony, you're going to be able to grow, as you say, the leafy greens, the arugula, the lettuce, the mizunas. You're going to be able to grow those better in a shadier balcony. And if you're on a balcony, you actually don't have a choice of where to garden. It's usually either sunny or shady.
Right.
So just choose the paths accordingly. You're right. That's perfect.
I have one other
Also,
thought. Oh, I have one other thought too, Donna. In terms of choosing where to put plants, I think put them somewhere where you will remember to care for them. Sometimes it's easy to set up a planter, but it's somewhere out of the way that you see infrequently, and then it's easy to forget about it. And often with containers in hot weather, they'll dry out quickly. So put it somewhere you will remember it.
and remember earlier you talked about the sip pots, the sub-irrigated pots. That's fantastic if you can use those, and I love those. But if you don't have that, you can also buy very small irrigation systems that just have a little outlet at each pot, and that can help those forgetful gardeners or people that just have it on a bit of a drip system. That really can help. So if you can't use a sip pot or sub-irrigated, we should do a whole session just on sub-irrigated pots as well. We're just drawing this out
Totally.
forever, aren't we?
Yeah. So let's just, well, on that note, we should just quickly talk about care, and I'll throw in the SIP pot. So SIP is an acronym for sub irrigated planter. And all it means, it's just a fancy way of saying that there is a reservoir in the bottom of that pot that holds a bit of extra water, which then wicks upwards as that soil begins to dry. And so this is great because it gives a consistent moisture all the time for the plants. And the worst thing that you can do for your container vegetable crops is just let them get dry. When it's moist, dry, that can have a huge effect on the quality of the growth that you're getting. So consistent moisture is what you should be thinking about. Those sip pots are great for that. Like you said, Donna, let's do a whole episode on sips because you can
Hmm.
build your own as well as buying them. And I guess I would say too, so consistent moisture is key. And in terms of feeding, without going into a whole bunch of detail about products, because there's so many different things out there. Everybody has a different approach to feeding, but I would just say that because the plant is growing in this very limited soil volume in this container, and often the commercial potting soils don't have any nutrients in them, then you have to feed. And my own preference is, because I get busy with camping and kids and life, is I like something that will slowly release so that I don't have to water on a liquid feed all the time. And what about you? What are you doing for feed?
Yeah, I find it easier to make sure when I'm remixing or reconditioning my soil in the spring to add a little bit, as I said, maybe some agricultural lime, maybe some slow release fertilizer. I do that, and that it could be an organic slow release. It doesn't have to be one of these big chemical products, but it's a way to know that there's some basic fertility happening for the plant. And then over the season, I just look for signs and symptoms. If I see some lower leaves turning yellow, I know I need to add more nitrogen. So then I can add a little bit of extra fertilizer as I go. But I always mix in kelp. And you can buy kelp as a dry product. You don't have to go out to an ocean and collect it. You can buy it as a dry product. It's just like a teaspoon per liter. It's very simple. Whenever you're fertilizing later in the season, you add a bit of liquid kelp, but you make it yourself with a bit of dry kelp. And it's a very excellent way to bring in those little micronutrients. There's another type of fertilizer. It's guinea pig food. Do you ever use alfalfa or the guinea pig
Yeah,
food?
actually,
Yeah,
I
we used to.
buy alfalfa meal from
Mhm.
a farm supplier around here. It's ground up into a powder.
And you could also buy it in the little pellets. So that's why I call it guinea pig food,
Mm.
because rabbits and guinea pig, if you can't, just go to a pet store, I guess, because there's, I think it's 17 or 18 micronutrients just in the alfalfa meal. So yeah, it's quite dusty when you just buy the loose meal. But I find that I use the pellets, I sprinkle them on the top. I can visualize, okay, that's about equal now, and work it in maybe in the top half inch. And it really helps feed the plants. And it's a simple thing you could do.
Good. Okay. Well, so summing up containers, Donna, I would say um, pick a suitable container for your aesthetic that's big enough for the plant. Think about the weight. Don't cheap out on soil. Soil is key. The location will depend on what you're growing. And don't forget, you need consistent moisture and feed. So those are my top points. And I guess I would say that container gardening, great if you have a small space because you can fit more in. But even if you are gardening in a bigger space, container gardening can be the key to success with some of these heat loving crops. So for me here in Toronto, it's always borderline with okra and eggplant in the ground because I'm on a heavy yellow clay soil that's slow to warm up. Put those in containers and they'll give me twice as much as if I grow them in the ground.
Or if you're growing in Grand Prairie or Edmonton or Whitehorse, if you put your plants in, say, black pots, which are going to really heat up against a south facing exposure, because they're raised and out of the ground, you don't have to wait for the soil to warm up. But also, you're able to get that extra heat to stimulate that extra growth on those crops. So it's a way of boosting your season, maybe one or two zones, just by directing what kind of pot you're using, where you're placing it. And of course, in conjunction with what plants you're growing, you don't want hot, dry for lettuce, but it's fantastic, as you said, for eggplants or for tomatoes. So you can position your pots even in your normal gardening. Maybe you've got a certain garden area that you limit yourself to, but you can add pots here and there to just expand what you're doing and how you're growing.
Excellent. That was fun, Donna. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
We'd love it if you drop by to say hi online at foodgardenlife.com. We have articles about growing fruit, veg, using your homegrown produce, also about growing figs and lemons in cold climates. So say hi. Tell us the topics that would help you grow more of your own. While you're at foodgardenlife.com, also grab our free newsletter. Subscribers get the subscriber-only cold climate fig guide and small space food gardening tip sheet.
You can head over to my website and grab my really cool printable PDF for a seed packet. You can personalize it for each type of seeds that you save. DonnaBalzer.com. Have a look.
You're listening to the Food Garden Life Show. I'm Stephen Biggs.
And I'm Donna Balzer, here to help you grow.